There are a number of non-tax and tax factors that should be considered when selecting the entity for the company. The big non-tax factor for a student technology company is financing. Where is the financing coming from? If venture financing is imminent, this is going to drive the entity choice. This is because venture capitalists will only invest in Delaware C corporations. If you don't think that you're going to be able to get venture financing right away, then you can consider the limited liability company or the S corporation, and then possibly convert those entities to a Delaware C corporation. Another non-tax factor to consider is who are the owners of the company. If venture financing isn't imminent, then it's important to understand who the owners are if you're considering an S corporation. If the owners are not United States citizens or resident aliens, then you're not able to form an S corporation. When selecting the business entity, you want to look at entities that are limited liability entities, such as the limited liability company or the corporation. This is another non-tax factor to consider. In addition, it's important to understand that particular entities are subject to certain types of formalities. For example, the corporation is subject to a number of different formalities, such as having shareholder meetings, keeping minutes, that the limited liability company is not required to comply with. This is another thing to consider if there's an opportunity to choose between a limited liability company and a corporation. Another non-tax factor to consider is whether you need to compensate your employees with options. If you select a corporation, it's easier to set up an option pool and issue options to your employees as opposed to a limited liability company. It's possible to offer options through a limited liability company, but it's much more difficult to structure this type of option pool. Finally, if you'd like to take your company public and you consider that the most viable exit plan for the company, then you'll want to establish as a corporation, as it's easier to take a company public in that form. The primary tax factors that you'll look at when selecting an entity is looking at the amount of losses that there could be with the company and whether you'll be able to take those losses against your individual income. If you form an LLC or an S Corp, then you'll be able to take those losses against your personal income. However, if you form a corporation, you will not be able to do that. You'll also want to consider whether you're taking profits from the company and providing those profits to the individual founders. If that's the case, those individual founders will be subject to self-employment tax. If you form an S corporation, you'll be able to minimize the amount of self-employment tax that you have to pay. Whereas with a limited liability company, you'll have to pay self-employment tax if you're active in the operation of the company.